Great, thank you very much. I'm going to just begin straight away by sharing my screen. So I'll start by saying good evening and welcome to the Introducing Buddhism course hosted by the Buddhist Society. So my name is Rachel Hilton, and I have been a member of the Society for around 20 years, and I've been teaching this course for a number of years. I'm also a doctor. I work in a teaching hospital in London. And hopefully during the course of the next few weeks, I'll be able to introduce you to some of the basic principles of Buddhism, and perhaps also give you some of the insights that Buddhism has brought into my practice as a doctor, and conversely, how my practice as a doctor has given me insights into Buddhism. So I'm going to begin by just reminding people of the structure of the course. So the course is going to run over 7 weeks, but because the course is on a Monday, we will lose 2 Mondays due to the May bank holiday, the early and late May bank holiday. So we won't have a class on those evenings, but the other Monday evenings we will run the talks as shown here. We're going to run through what is Buddhism. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the Buddha's teachings, and that will run through to the 14th of June, where we will end with a class around meditation and some ideas about where you may like to go with your Buddhist practice if you choose to continue with this. And just the structure of the course of the talks will be as tonight. So my aim will be to speak for around 40 or 45 minutes, and to leave around 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So Lavinia, who's the administrator, will take your questions through the chat, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can. You can also ask questions through your registration form. When you registered for the course, there was a question section in that as well. And just to remind you that although you don't have to be a member of the Buddhist Society to join these courses, if you choose to join the Buddhist Society, you'll be very welcome, and the information how to do that is on the website. So we're going to begin tonight with the first of our talks, and I'm going to talk tonight about what is Buddhism, what are the basic principles that we're going to be covering in the course, and also the life story of the Buddha, because Buddhism is the body of teaching and practice that grew up around the life of an individual called Siddhartha Gautama, and he's the one who became Buddha, which is a term which means awake, someone who's enlightened, someone who sees things the way they are. So we're going to talk about this man, when he lived, who he was, and what his life was like, and how his teachings developed into the religion of Buddhism as we know it today. And before we get into the body of the talk, I just want to say a few words about language. If you're reading anything about Buddhism, you will come across some terms in the languages of Sanskrit and Pali, and I just want to say that we will have to use some of these terms as we hear about Buddhism, and I just want to give you a little bit of background into Sanskrit and Pali. So to begin by saying that the Buddha, the person who became the Buddha, lived 2.5 millennia ago at a time when things weren't written down. So the original teachings that the Buddha gave were, he taught people orally. It was an oral tradition, and his teachings were passed on by word of mouth. And it was really only a couple of 100 years after he died that people started to write down what he said. And the language in which the teachings were written down is the language of Sanskrit, which was the language of the scholars in India, the language of the elite scholarly people. And in later years, the Sanskrit words were translated into a more language of the more common people, the Pali language, which was more a vernacular language. And that's the language which is used for most of the teachings that are used today in the Theravada tradition, which we're going to talk more about later in the talk. And the two languages are actually fairly similar. So Sanskrit and Pali do look very similar. Pali looks, if you like a very simplified form of Sanskrit, but you don't have to be a scholar of these languages to understand about Buddhism. But there are certain terms we will come across for which there is no exact English translation. The translations are either multiple translations or very subtle translations, for which only really the Sanskrit or Pali terms will do. Buddha itself, that word is a Sanskrit word. Dharma, nirvana, these are things, these are words which have really passed into our sort of common language, but they do have Sanskrit and Pali roots. But I'm going to try wherever possible and as far as possible to give you the English translations and use English terms rather than Sanskrit or Pali terms, but there will be occasions where only Sanskrit or Pali will do. So let's begin by talking about what is Buddhism, and it's probably easier to begin by saying what it isn't. So the first thing to say is the thing you will not find in Buddhism is the concept of a God. This is God with a capital G, by which I mean a creator, divinity who transcends his creation. We will come across gods with a small g in the Buddhist mythology, and they're there really for as teaching aids, if you like. But there's no divinity in Buddhism. We don't worship a god. We certainly don't worship the Buddha. The Buddha is not a god. So lots of people like to debate on whether Buddhism is indeed a religion at all. For those of you who define a religion as being something that has a creator divinity, then Buddhism doesn't really fulfill that. So there is no God. The second thing we don't have in Buddhism is any received book, no book that's been handed down that contains everything you need to know. In other words, the equivalent of the Bible or the Quran. There is no text of that exact equivalence in Buddhism. So no written words that you have to take as this is the whole body of the religion contained in these texts. So nothing of that sort. So again, this marks this out as being rather separate from some of the religions we may be more familiar with. And finally, there's no equivalent in Buddhism of the 10 commandments. In other words, there are no rules that you have to follow. There's nothing that says you must do this to be a Buddhist, and if you don't do this, you're not a Buddhist. Nothing of that sort. It's not to say that Buddhism is a completely amoral practice without any ethics or morals at all. Of course, there are certain behaviors we try to follow, and we will talk about those later in the course, but there's no equivalent to the 10 commandments, the rules that all Buddhists must follow, nothing of that sort. So it's actually going to be quite a different experience if you're used to the Abrahamic religions and the types of concepts that come across in those. This is rather different. So the thing about Buddhism that's very important to get hold of is it's not really a religion where you have to believe something just because that's what's told to you. And in fact, the Buddha was really, it's quite the opposite. This is a religion that you try these principles out for yourself. You try the concepts out for yourself and see if they work. And this is told in a very nice sutra. So the sutras are the teachings, the oral teachings of the Buddha himself. So these relate to a time when the Buddha was traveling through India, and he came through a particular area where lots of gurus and teachers were coming through and teaching at that time. And the people who lived in that area said, well, why should we believe you? Because every year or two, some guru comes through teaching us this, that, or the other. What's so different about what you're teaching? And the Buddha gave this advice to the people of that area, the Kalamas. This was the Kalama Sutra. And what he said was, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they have been handed down for many generations. Do not believe in anything because it is spoken and rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. But after observation and analysis, when you find anything that agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. So this is actually a core part of Buddhist practice, is that we are expected to try out what the Buddha taught. And if it's good, if it's wholesome, if it's a skillful means of doing things, then we do it. But we don't take anything just on trust, on blind faith. That is not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha taught you try it, and if it works, you continue it. And I would say that this is very important for you all. If you want to go ahead in a Buddhist practice, then you're perfectly willing to do that. But if you simply find there are things of interest in this course that you want to take away into other areas of your life, then that's also fine as well. And this actually sums up what the Buddha taught. This is not to say that you can all disappear off now and leave the next 7 weeks and don't have to sit through any more of this, but this is the essence of what the Buddha taught. He said, I teach one thing and one thing only, that is suffering and the end of suffering. And we will talk more about this in detail when we talk about the Four Noble Truths in a future lecture. But by suffering, suffering is a word that really relates to a Sanskrit word called dukkha. Really, this is about the unsatisfactoriness of life, the fact that each and every one of us has probably had an inkling at some time in our lives that things aren't quite as they should be, things aren't quite as we thought they ought to be, things are perhaps not as comfortable, as easy, as life isn't quite as we wished it to be. That sense of disease, discomfort, slight frustration, this is really the fundamental thing that brings us all into a Buddhist practice, or brings us to explore Buddhism. The idea that things are not quite right, something's not working for us, we're not as happy as we should be. And the Buddha encapsulated that in this teaching, that we're all suffering, we're all slightly dissatisfied, unhappy, we're all struggling with life, it isn't going as it should be. And he said, yes, that is the fact. It is not comfortable or easy or straightforward, but I'm going to show you why that is, and I'm going to show you how to put that right and how to live your life in a different way. So the Buddha taught suffering or discomfort or disease or frustration or annoyance, but he also, like any good doctor, he didn't just diagnose the illness, he gave us the treatment and the way to live life in a different way, in a more harmonious way. So that is really the principle of Buddhism, and we'll go into the detail of that over the course of the next 7 weeks. Now, I'm going to use a lot of teaching stories through this course, parables, if you like. And this is a very important and famous parable, which is the parable of the poisoned arrow. And back even in the Buddha's time, as certainly is true today, people were very interested and in fact obsessed with questions which weren't really so very important. Questions like, what happens to me after I die? Is the universe infinite? And a lot of us get very concerned that we need the answer to these questions. We want to know everything that there is to know before we will commit to changing our behaviors. And the Buddha summed this up very nicely in this parable of the poisoned arrow, which is in your information packs for the course. And the analogy he gave was a man is shot with an arrow, the tip of which has been coated in poison. So if the arrow remains there, the man is going to die. And his friends say, let's take it out, let's pull the arrow out. And the man says, no, don't pull it out until I know these important things. Number one, who shot the arrow? Who was the man who shot it? Who were his people? What village was he from? What type of man was he? Was he rich? Was he poor? What did he look like? Was he tall? Was he short? Was he fair-skinned? Was he dark-skinned? And the arrow that he shot, what was it made of? What was the wood? What was it? Was it a hard wood, a soft wood? What was the arrow bound with? Was it bound with twine or bamboo or sinew? And the feathers, what kind of bird did those feathers come from? Was it a peacock, an owl, a crow? And the poison that the tip is coated in, what was that poison made from? Was it made of this or that? What was the shape of the arrowhead like? The Buddha said, while you're asking all these questions about the arrow, the poison is poisoning you. The point is not to say, I need to know all this stuff. The point is to get the arrow pulled out. And that really is what the Buddha's teachings are getting at. Don't be worrying about where we go in the next life, whether the universe is infinite, etc., etc. Just let's get on with the point at hand, which is to pull out that poison, to get ourselves to leading a more harmonious, happier life without troubling to know every single thing we could possibly know before we make a start on the journey. So that is the point of the story, is if we're going to do a Buddhist practice, then let's get on and do it. Let's not mess about saying, no, I need to understand this, that. The point is just to get on and get to the root of why we suffer and get to the solution and how to end our suffering without worrying too much about the small detail along the way. So the Buddha's life story, the first thing to say is that the Buddha is, the name Buddha means one who is awake, one who is enlightened, one who sees things the way they really are. But the man who became Buddha or awakened was born an ordinary man. And he was born, we're not actually sure when he was born. He may have been born, scholars think it was somewhere between 560 and 480 BCE, before Common Era. And he was born into a very wealthy family. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and his father was a local chieftain, a local ruler, and he ruled a clan called the Shakyamunis. And the place where the Buddha was born is in this place here, Lumbini, and it's actually on the borders of India and Nepal. It's just over the border, actually, in what is now Nepal. So the Buddha was born an ordinary person, Siddhartha Gautama, an ordinary man. And the story goes that when he was born, the local soothsayers and wise men came to see him, and they immediately realized that this was a baby who had great potential in life, and that he was going to be either a great leader, as in a chief, a general, a great ruler like his father, or he might become a great religious sage. And that leads into the story of why his childhood was as it was. But before I go to that part of the story, there's quite a lot of mythology that surrounds the story of the Buddha's birth. So his father, as I said, was a local head of the local clan, the Shakyamunis. His father was called Siddhartha, and his wife was called, his mother, Siddhartha's wife, was called Maya. And it's said that at the time of the Buddha's conception, Queen Maya had a dream. She dreamt that an elephant came to her in the night and entered into her belly through her side. And this is a carving showing the elephant coming in Queen Maya's dream and entering through her side. So there was already an element of mystery and wonder surrounding the Buddha's conception. And it's said that when the Buddha was born, when Siddhartha Gautama was born, Queen Maya was traveling with her retinue, and she was traveling through these gardens, these pleasure gardens in Lumbini, and that she gave birth in the gardens, and she was standing holding onto a tree, and the Siddhartha Gautama was born, came out through her side, as you can see in this picture here. He came out through her side rather than in the natural way. And it's also said that when he was born, he took 7 steps to the north, and lifting one hand to the sky and the other hand to the ground, he said, "Between heaven and earth, I alone am the world-honored one." So here already we have a rather miraculous and mysterious birth. And of course you would say, well, that all sounds a little bit unrealistic. I wouldn't say I've ever seen this happening on any of the maternity wards I've ever worked on. But of course, this isn't really an actual true story. This is pointing towards the birth of a spiritual awakening. This is a birth of a spiritual practice, not an actual birth. And as I say, the sage who came to see the child when he was born said he's either going to be a great leader or he's going to be a religious sage. And his parents thought, well, we like the idea of a religious sage. That's a very nice thing indeed. But actually, we'd rather he was a great leader and a warrior like his father and led the Shakyamuni clan and took over the local area and all those things. So they decided that the way to stop him going down the religious path, if you like, was to make sure that he led a very, very happy and comfortable life, because they thought, well, if he is kept from all the hard things in life, he'll never get any interest in religion and spirituality. So Siddhartha was brought up in absolute pleasure and luxury. He was living in his father's palace. It said that he had a winter palace, he had a summer palace, and he was given every pleasure in life. He was trained in all the courtly arts. He was trained to be a warrior. He was trained to shoot and hunt. And when the time came, he married Yasodhana, his lovely wife, who he won her hand in marriage through winning an archery contest. And he had lived this fantastic life up until the age of 29. He'd even had a child, a son called Rahula. So all was going very, very well. He was leading a life of utter bliss and luxury. And yet he wasn't totally content. And that is important, because even though he had wealth and privilege, even so, there was something was lacking. And that led him to, at the age of 29, these 4 fateful journeys of discovery. So the legend has it that his chariot driver, whose name was Channa, took Siddhartha out from the palace on 4 journeys. And these are shown here. On the first journey, he saw a man who was very old, very bent over and looking very frail. And he had never seen an elderly person before, because these people were kept from him in his blissful palace. And he said to Channa, the charioteer, "What's wrong with that man?" And the charioteer said, "Well, he's just an old man. We all grow old." And that was a shock to Siddhartha. The second journey, they met a man who was ill, who had disease. And again, he'd not come across anybody who was ill, who was diseased. And he said to Channa, "What's wrong with him?" And Channa said, "Well, he's sick. He's ill. We all get sick. We all get ill." And on the third journey, they met a corpse being taken off to the ghats to be cremated. And again, Siddhartha said, what's that?" And Channa said, "It's a dead man. We all die." And this was a great shock to Siddhartha, because he hadn't been exposed to old age, disease, or death. And this set him wondering why these things would happen. Why doesn't everybody live a life of utter bliss? And then on the fourth journey, on the final journey, they met a holy man who was sitting in meditation outside the city gates. And this man was so suffused with bliss and contentment. And Siddhartha said, "Well, how can he be so happy knowing that there is old age, sickness, and death in the world? And yet this man here is so content, so happy. How is that?" And Channa said, "Well, it's because he's a holy man. He has a religious practice." And that really made Siddhartha ponder. And he decided at the age of 29, these questions grew so overwhelming for him. This issue of, why do we suffer? Why do we have to grow old? Why do we have to get ill? Why do we have to die? And he decided at the age of 29 that he was going to have to go out and find the answer to that question. And it's said that he went to see his wife, who was asleep, and his child Rahula was sleeping. And then he said goodbye to them while they slept and crept out of the palace at dead of night. And he decided he was going to live the life of an ascetic. He was going to strive to find the answer to why there was suffering in the world, why there was disease, old age, and death. And here he is, cutting off his long hair and putting on the robes of an ascetic. And he went then for the next 6 years, traveling around the rivers, the Ganges, and learning from every single teacher that he could come across what is the answer to why we suffer. And it is said that he trained with the foremost teachers of his day and became so adept in the practices they taught him that each of them said, "You can take over from me, you are going to be my successor." But he said, "No, I haven't found the answer to what I'm looking for, in spite of all the hard work I've put in." And he became more and more austere in his practice. And here he is, he became so gaunt, so skeletal. It's said that he could put his hand onto his stomach and take hold of his spine through the front of his stomach, because he had become so gaunt. He was close to death. And as you probably know, in India around that time, lots of people were quite interested in these practices of austerity. And by this stage, he'd gathered a little group around him of practitioners. There were 5 of them who were very impressed by the fact that he was able to survive on 1 grain of rice and 1 morsel of milk in the day. And they were all practicing together. But Siddhartha realized, once he'd continued this way and he got to the point where he was very close to death, he thought, I'm going to die here, I'm going to starve to death, and I still won't have found the answer to why we suffer, why we have to grow old and die. And at that point, a local milkmaid was coming past with a pail of milk and some rice porridge. And it said that she gave him some rice porridge to eat, and he ate it and went down to the river to bathe. Whereupon his friends, who were the other spiritual practitioners he'd been training with, said, oh, he's taken to the soft life, and they left him. So now we have a man who's given up everything. He's given up his life of great luxury. He's been training and practicing to the point virtually of death. So he's almost lost his life. He's lost his spiritual followers. They turned their backs on him and said, we're not following him anymore. He's leading a life of luxury. So he had lost everything. If you like, he'd reached rock bottom. And this was a very important moment for him. He was now 35 years old, and he knew that if he didn't find the end to his quest, if he didn't find out the root cause of suffering, that he would die. So he swore a vow, and this happened in a place called Bodh Gaya, which is still a place of great spiritual pilgrimage. He swore this vow. He said, flesh may wither away, blood may dry up, but until I gain enlightenment, I shall not move from this seat. And he sat down under the Bodhi tree, which is a fig tree, and he swore that he would stay there until he'd either gained enlightenment or he died. Now, at this point in the story, a very important character enters the story, and this is a character called Mara. And we will hear much about Mara as we go on through the course. Mara is not the devil or anything of that sort, but Mara forms more of a tempter. Mara is there to challenge Siddhartha in his practice, and indeed to challenge us in our practice. But the representation of Mara is of a demonic figure who realized, as Gautama sat down under that Bodhi tree and swore that solemn vow, that Gautama was very, very close to the end of his quest, that he was about to discover the reason why people suffer and how to bring about an ending to that. And he was about to achieve enlightenment. And at this point, Mara decided he would do all in his power to make sure that this didn't happen and that Siddhartha did not achieve his goal. So he did 3 things. The first thing he did was he came to Siddhartha and said, now listen, you've done a lot. You've been practicing hard for 6 years. You've achieved marvelous things. Your spiritual teachers wanted you to take over from them. Haven't you done enough? Isn't it time to go home, take up the reins again, look after your father's inheritance, look after your family, look after your wife, look after your child? Surely now is the time to pack it in and go home and lead a responsible life. But Siddhartha carried on and sat. So the next thing that happened was Mara sent his beautiful daughters, you can see here, to tempt Siddhartha with sensual pleasure. So they came with flowers and perfume and tried to tempt him out of meditation, but Siddhartha just carried on and sat through that. And then finally he sent his sons, who are demonic, warlike figures, who threw spears and arrows at him to try and frighten him out of this. And it's said that the spears and arrows all turned into little flowers as they came near Siddhartha. And this is actually interesting, because when we are trying to do things that are perhaps a little bit uncomfortable, so let's say it's 7:30 and it's time for me to go and do my meditation, quite often a little voice says to me, "Oh, come on, you've had such a hard day. You can sit down and watch a little bit of television. You don't have to sit on your meditation cushion tonight." So there's a little voice of reason there. Come on, be sensible. And then you think, oh, and it's so comfortable here, and I can watch the first episode of Line of Duty. Sensual pleasure creeps in. And then if you resist all those things, eventually the little voice just says, "No, I don't want to do it." So we go through these things ourselves when we're challenged. The question is, do we give in, or do we sit as Siddhartha did and sit through these various ways which were sent to tempt him or frighten him away from his resolve? So he continued to sit, and it is said that he sat for 8 days, and on the morning, so he sat for 8 days and 8 nights. On the morning of the 8th day, he came out of meditation and saw the morning star. And at that moment, he realized, he said he saw into all his past lives, and he realized what he'd been looking for, the cause of suffering, the way out of suffering. He became enlightened. And it's said that his first words after enlightenment were these: "How wonderful, how miraculous. All beings are fully endowed with the wisdom and power of the Tathagata," which is another word for Buddha. But sadly, human beings, due to sticky attachments, are not aware of it. And this is very important, because what he was saying was, we have all got within us the capacity to follow his path and gain the enlightenment that he gained. But the things that hold us back are our ignorance of the fact that we have Buddha nature within us, and our sticky attachments to pleasure, our aversion to discomfort, etc. And we'll speak more of that as we go on through the course. So he was now 35 years old, and initially he thought, what I have discovered is so profound, no one else will understand it. And it is said at this point that the gods intervened, and Brahma himself came and said, "Please, there are some people whose eyes are just a little covered in dust, who will understand what you teach. Please go out and teach other people what you have learned." And the first people he found were those 5 ascetics who'd abandoned him before, and they saw immediately that something had changed, that he looked different, and he sat down and gave his first teachings to them, and he taught them in the deer park in Sarnath, and that's said to be the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. The Buddha gave his first, because he was now the Buddha, the enlightened one, the awakened one. He gave his first teachings to those 5 ascetics, and the first things he taught them were the middle way and the 4 noble truths, which we will talk about in the future lessons. And he spent the next 45 years traveling up and down the Ganges, teaching. He taught just anybody and everybody, and he used language that people could understand. He taught people in ways that were helpful for them. He was a very skilled teacher, but at the age of 80, he became ill. It's variously said he had food poisoning or possibly dysentery, And eventually he was at the point of death, and his followers were obviously distraught. And they said, who's going to follow you after you die? And he said, well, the teachings. I'm not leaving any successor. I'm leaving just my body of teaching, the Dharma. That will be your guide. And his followers had to then remember everything that he'd taught them over the years. In fact, it's said that his cousin Ananda, who had been his personal companion and had looked after him all these years, remembered the bulk of what the Buddha had taught. And these things were then repeated from person to person to person and passed down. And eventually, as I said, they were written down. So he died at the age of 80 in a place called Kushinagar. And his last words were these: impermanent are all compounded things, strive on heedfully. And we will talk later about what impermanence means and what compounded things mean. But he urged us at the point of death to get on with following the path he'd laid open for us. And the point he was saying here was, time is short. We will all end up, we will all grow old, we will all get sick, we will all die. And if you want to discover what I've discovered, which is the end of suffering, you need to get on with it. And then for the next couple of 100 years, his teachings were passed on word to word, from person to person, and the teachings gradually spread. And they first of all spread down into what is now Sri Lanka, and that's where one of the oldest Buddhist religious groups, the Theravadan Buddhists, that's one of the places where that particular religion is very, very strong. The religion spread out up north into Tibet, following the old Silk Route, across into China, and eventually over into Korea and then into Japan. So Buddhism spread slowly from the time of the Buddha's death over the next several hundred years. And broadly, the teachings of the Buddha developed into 3 different schools of Buddhism, shown here on this map. So the oldest school of Buddhism, shown in red here, is the Theravadan school, and that's also called the Way of the Elders. So you will have seen the monks who wear saffron robes in Thailand and Sri Lanka and Burma. So they are practicing a very sort of old, perhaps one of the oldest forms of Buddhism, the Theravada school. But Buddhism has the capacity to take on the flavors of wherever it settles. So as the teachings of the Buddha moved up into Tibet and Mongolia, this took on quite a lot of the characteristics of the local religions there, the Bon religion. So the school of Tibetan Buddhism has its roots fairly strongly in the Tibetan religions that were there before Buddhism came. So that's a different school of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And going through China, across into Korea and Japan, we developed the forms of Buddhism that you can see in the Zen teachings now. Again, picking up a lot of the local flavors and cultures as Buddhism progressed. And by and large, we divide Buddhism into the southern schools, which is the Theravadan school, and the northern schools, which encompasses the Tibetan school, or the Vajrayana school, and the Mahayana school. And we're going to talk more about those towards the end of the course. So just a word about the schools of Buddhism, because obviously in this day and age, we don't say, oh, I'm a Buddhist. People say, oh, I'm a Zen Buddhist, or I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, or whatever. And if you look at these different schools, things look very different. So I'm a long time ago, my hairdresser told me she was a Buddhist. And I said, oh, what sort of Buddhist are you? And it turned out she had a school of Buddhism that was so remote from the one I was training in that I didn't even understand what she did in her practice, and she didn't understand what I did in my practice. But the point about this is that deep down, the root of all of these schools of Buddhism, even though they look very, very different, people have different cultural practices, different rituals, deep down at the heart of all of this, the basic principles of Buddhism are the same. And these are the principles that we will be teaching on this course. And this, in the words of Yoka Daishi, only let us take hold of the root and not worry about the branches. So don't get too hung up with what this particular school of Buddhism looks like, or that particular school of Buddhism. Deep down, the root of it is it's all basic Buddhism, and that's what we will be learning on this course. And just finally to say that you can read about Buddhism, you can listen to this course, you can watch videos, etc. But unless you actually do it, you won't really get any further. The point is you have to do it. You can't just read about it and think about it. You actually have to follow a Buddhist practice if you want to get towards the awakening, the enlightenment, the cessation of suffering that the Buddha taught. So as the Buddha himself said, you yourself must walk the path. Buddhas do but point the way. So what the Buddha did was he discovered a way, a path which is available for all of us to walk. Any of us can do this, but you have to do it. No one can do it for you. If you want to follow the Buddha's path, you have to actually set your foot along that journey and walk it yourself. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to take some questions. We have about 10 minutes or so, and Lavinia, I hope, has got the questions, if there are any.
Yes. Thank you so much for this lesson, Rachel. So I've got a few questions in the chat. And the first one is from Tracy, who's asking, good evening, and thank you very much for the interesting talk. At what point in your practice and learning can you actually call yourself a Buddhist? And also, is it necessary to routinely attend Sangha meetings? Thank you.
At what point can you call yourself a Buddhist? Well, you can call yourself a Buddhist at any point. There are some schools of Buddhism which ask you to make a certain commitment to your Buddhist practice. That's called taking the Refuges. So you say, I'm going to put my trust in the Buddha. I'm going to put my trust in the things the Buddha taught, the Dharma. I'm going to put my trust in my fellow Buddhists, which is the Sangha. But other traditions don't regard that as very important. So you can call yourself a Buddhist at any point, but if you're not actually following a Buddhist life, not doing things in the way that Buddhists regard as skillful, wholesome, and ethical, it's probably a little bit bogus. Sorry, Lavinia, the other part to that question.
Is it necessary to routinely attend Sangha meetings?
I think it is very important, if you are going to do this, to have the support of a group of fellow-minded people, because it's actually very, very difficult to do it on your own. And if you do it on your own, you can very quickly, rather than follow the Buddhist way, you end up following my way, because it's very easy to put your own little spin and twist on things. So sometimes you need the support of a Buddhist community. And by Sangha, I mean the community of Buddhists. I don't mean just ordained people, although in some senses, Sangha refers to the ordained people. I'm also talking about lay practitioners. It is very, very helpful to commit to a practice. And by commitment, that often means joining a group, making a regular commitment to sit with those people, to hear talks with those people, etc., etc. Because A, it's very, very helpful for them if you make a commitment to join them. B, it's very, very helpful for you because those people will support you with your practice. And also, it is helpful not to go off on your own little route, because very quickly you'll find yourself doing things not the way that you've been taught how to do things, but the way it actually suits you rather better. And suddenly you're not actually doing a Buddhist practice at all. You're doing your own thing. And that's actually quite a risky thing to do. So I would say, yes, it is important because it's mutually supportive, beneficial, and also it demonstrates to you when you're doing things appropriately and when you might be doing things a little bit more off-piste and perhaps heading in your own direction. You sometimes need people to say, actually, why are you doing that? And bring you back back onto the path. So yes, it is very, very helpful to be part of a group.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We have another question here from Chris, who's asking, is the goal of Buddhism to reach enlightenment? If so, then how can we practice Buddhism but also have attachment to family?
Is the goal of Buddhism to achieve enlightenment? Yes, it is. So the goal of Buddhism is to see things the way they are. So by enlightenment, I mean a really comprehensive understanding of how the nature of reality, rather than seeing things through our own deluded vision of how things might be, how things should be, how things ought to be. And we'll talk a lot more of that in next week's course, what I mean by delusion. So how can you be attached to family? It is very important to realize that if you're following a Buddhist course and you are trying to diminish attachments, aversions, etc., you don't become completely emotionless people. Buddhists are allowed to fall in love, marry, have friendships, have likes and dislikes. The point isn't that you'll become a completely neutral, emotionless person. The point is that these things do not overwhelm and consume you. There is a vast difference between being committed to your family and being so deeply attached to your family to the exclusion of all else around you that you actually start doing harm to other people. So the goal of your Buddhist practice is, yes, you remain attached to your family and, love and care and look after them, but you will become equally attached or equally caring and compassionate about other people's families and ultimately about the entire universe of sentient beings. So rather than saying this is my family and therefore these are particular to me and special to me and I will defend them to the bitter end, you become more compassionate, more caring, and you extend that compassion and goodwill to people outside your family. First of all, to your friends, to your neighbors, to people you don't like, and ultimately to the whole universe. That is the ultimate goal of enlightenment, is yes, you care for your family, but you care for everyone else as well.
Thank you. Do we have time for another question, Rachel?
Yes.
Okay. So the next one is from Leighton. What is the current consensus on the historicity of Siddhartha Gautama? Do scholars still believe he was a real historical person?
Well, it's like Jesus. Did Jesus live? There is some evidence that Siddhartha Gautama did live, and he was a real person, but in a sense, it doesn't actually matter. He certainly, the life that I've just described to you is a mythological story which has teaching points in it. And yes, there probably was a real person who really did do the things that he did. But in a sense, it doesn't matter. If someone came to me this second and said, he never existed, this is all just fiction, it wouldn't matter, because the teachings, the practice and the principles remain real. So how much of him is a historical person who actually did what he did and said what he said, and how much of it is the stuff that has been added in later years, it doesn't really matter. Just as I would suggest that many Christians would say, you know, the truth of the life of Jesus actually doesn't matter. What matters today is how we live our lives now. But yes, there is evidence that there was such a person as Siddhartha Gautama. It's very little evidence because, of course, it was a long time ago and quite a lot of the things have disappeared now. But he probably did exist in the form, more or less, at the time that we think he lived and did the things we think he did. But it's almost, in a sense, irrelevant now for modern day Buddhists, the real person, because the principle of the Buddha, the teachings, the things he taught, that's what lives on now. So I think most Buddhists would say it doesn't really matter, but probably he did these things, but in a sense it doesn't matter because his teachings remain very pertinent today.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I have some more questions in the chat.
Okay.
The next one is from Step. How does Buddhism look to your past? Meaning everything you did or who you were before starting the Buddhist path. Is there any forgiveness or way towards redemption that the Buddha describes?
I haven't fully understood that story, or the question there. How does Buddhism look to one's past or my past?
Yes, I think Steph means, how does the Buddha looks at what you did in the past? Is there any forgiveness or way towards redemption? So maybe looking at
So we will talk in a future talk in the course about the principle of karma, which is that the things that you have done will have consequences now and in the future. So this is not retribution or redemption or of anything that sort. Karma is a very neutral process. So you do something today, there will be consequences tomorrow. You did something last year, there are consequences today. It just absolutely follows through that if you do something with intention, be it good or bad, you set up a chain of events which leads to a karmic consequence later. But that isn't really anything like punishment for sin. There's no concept of sin in Buddhism. It's simply skillful things and unskillful things. You're not being punished for anything. In a sense, that means you don't need redemption for anything. What it just means is you do something today, a consequence will evolve tomorrow. And if you are doing helpful, wholesome things, those consequences will be beneficial for yourself and for others. If you're doing unwholesome, unhelpful things, those consequences will be unhelpful and maybe even unpleasant for yourself and others. And it's absolutely a completely neutral, the karma, law of karma is a completely neutral thing. No one is punishing us. No one is there to redeem us. We simply reap what we sow. So whatever I did in my past, I'm reaping the rewards or consequences of that now. What I do today, I will reap the consequences of that in the future. That is the rule of karma. There doesn't need to be anybody judging it. There's nobody saying that was a bad thing, you get punished, that was a good thing, you get rewarded. It is simply a consequence of what we do. So if what we do is helpful, there will be helpful consequences in the future, and the converse is also true. So in terms of past past and present and future, it is the law of karma which covers those things. And we are going to talk about karma in a future talk. It's one of the great misunderstood things in Buddhism, I would say. So we'll spend quite a bit of time on it. But redemption, in a sense, there is no such thing in Buddhism because we don't have any sin. You simply will get the benefit, that you'll live the consequences of what you did, whether that's positive or negative. It will happen sooner or later. I think we can take one more question and then we should wrap up.
Okay, thank you. So that question is from Owen, who's asking, when did Buddhism start to come over to the West? And was there a particular branch that started that?
So Buddhism came to the West. Well, the Buddhist Society is the oldest Buddhist society in the West, actually, and that started just nearly 100 years ago now, and it really began with an interest in theosophy, which is a sort of blend of different sort of religious and spiritual practices. But essentially, Buddhism came to the UK through the work of Christmas Humphreys, who's the founder of our society, who came upon Buddhism really in his late teens, not long after his brother had been killed in the First World War. Buddhism really went to America in the middle part of the last century, largely because there were a lot of people from Japan who'd ended up there around the time of the war and stayed there. So the Japanese tradition, certainly on the west coast of America, lent itself very easily towards Zen Buddhism. Lots of people went through at the time of the beatniks in the 50s, went around Asia and took Eastern religious practices back into America. So Buddhism in the West, by which I mean this country and America, is a very, very new practice. It's really only established itself over the last 100 years or so. And as I said to you before, Buddhism does like to take on lots of adaptations from the society it finds itself in. So Buddhism in the West is adapting some of our Western traditions and cultures into itself. Whether it emerges into a successful way of living, I think remains to be seen. We've only got 100 years or so of practice to look back on. We hope that it does, but it's very new in the West, and really through, as I say, partly through people coming back from Japan after the Second World War into America, and partly through the work of Christmas Humphreys and his interest in theosophy in this country. So it's very new as a Western practice, very new indeed, only really barely 100 years old. I think we should draw that to a close now, Lavinia, and there will be lots, I hope, of opportunity to ask questions at the end of each lecture. Now, starting next week, we're actually going to go on to what the Buddha taught. So we're going to learn some of the key things that he taught. There will be homework. So I will give you exercises to do each week for you to try, because as I've said, it's a practice where you try things out and see what works for you. I will give you some things to try at home, which will give you a flavor of the types of things that are involved in a Buddhist practice, and a way of experimenting in your own lives with the types of things that are useful for Buddhists to do. So I will leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.